Hi, welcome to Texas History. Now, this is the second session of the seventh topic of the semester titled Modernity and Progress Arrives to Texas from 1876 to 1920. Now, in this second session, we are going to continue discussing now the actual changes that are going to transpire in the state of Texas just at the end of the Reconstruction process, 1876 onwards. Okay, in session one, what we did was to really explain in great detail how Texas is going to be transitioning from a traditional economy and traditional setting, a traditional social setting, into a more modern economy based on industrial capitalism and a more modern society as well, based on large industrial cities. So in session one, I make sure to I made sure to explain very clearly what the traditional setting of Texas looked like. Texas as it was prior to 1876, prior to modernity. And we explain, just in very general terms here, how Texas was a very traditional society and economy because it was still largely based on agricultural production. The Texas economy was an agricultural economy, and agricultural economies are considered traditional in the sense that they existed before the era of industry, before the era of modern science and technology. This is how human society sustained themselves around the globe for thousands of years before the advent of the Industrial Revolution, that is to say. That was the tradition. That's how people made their living. They were growing their own food and so on and so forth again. Very traditional techniques, traditional forms of farming, using animals for plowing the land, and families had to work together to actually grow food and the like. We explained how the state of Texas devoted a certain section to what is called crash crop agriculture. This is, again, the area of plantation economy. The plantation owners who really constituted a tiny minority in the state of Texas were actually growing cash crops like primarily cotton, and also they were growing sugar for exports. Again, so that was an aspect of the Texas agricultural economy. But concerning the masses, as I explained in session one, the rest of the population who are not planters, they engage in what is called subsistence farming. They were just growing their own food, in family farms. We talked about that, the small Texas family farm, in which the whole family was the enterprise and everybody had to contribute to the family economy, growing their own food. Things like corn, wheat, and other vegetables. There was also cattle ranching, I explained. Cattle ranching was part of this traditional setting as well. There were very wealthy ranches, of course, but also there were very small ranches, thousands of them across Texas, again, in which families own small plots of land and raise cattle and the like as well. And most people live in the countryside. The reality, the social setting in Texas is that most people lived in the countryside. This is what is called a rural society. Again, people actually live in small agrarian or agricultural communities, if you will, not large cities. Of course, some cities are on the rise prior to 1876, like Houston, Texas, Galveston, and San Antonio, but they're not yet reaching to the level of being industrial cities. Those are really just large towns, if you will, but most people live in the countryside. We also explain how, in session one, some of the features of modernity, so we can begin to identify what entails to be modern. If Texas is now transitioning towards a modern economy and a modern society, it was important to identify those characteristics. of modernity. So we explained how modern societies, first and foremost, have industrial economies. First and foremost, industrial economies. They have developed things like factories, industrial plants, for example, in which they use machinery in order to produce everything that the society requires, everything that the society needs is produced inside of a factory, that is to say. So the machinery, this technology that came with the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s and 1800s, again, was considered to be new. A new mode of production, a new way of doing things, a new way of creating and manufacturing products. The assistance of machines, again, it's called the machine age. So this is considered new, in other words, modern. So this is one feature of a modern society that Texas is about to become, as we will discuss in this session. Modern science and technology was another feature, again, and is still today considered a fundamental feature of a modern society, a society that is guided by modern science and modern technology, developing things like the tools of essential life, like electricity, telecommunications, for example, transportation systems, things like chemistry, pharmaceuticals, and so on. All of those tools, if you will, are considered part of modern science and technology that are supposed to solve problems for people and also make life easier and better for people. Even commerce is made better through the use of modern science and technology. So societies that have modern science and technology are considered modern or new, again. So modern societies also live in cities. We explained large industrial cities, something that we're going to get to see, of course, in this topic, how Texas is transitioning to this new setting. People are going to be moving into the cities in great numbers. The cities are places where people find work, find employment, wages. They also find the arts and the sciences there, culture, and education systems as well. Public education, universities are in the cities where people can receive an education and be prepared to live in a modern environment. Okay, where they can operate the machines, they can operate the new technologies, and perhaps even innovate new ones, if you will. And last but not least, another very critical component that I discussed in session one was that modern societies are also characterized by certain cultural values, such as the value of material progress and material happiness. There is this belief among modern societies that the here and the now, this physical world that we live in, must be taken care of, that we must nurture it, and that we must progress in it. We need to, for example, live more comfortably. And in order to do that, we need to get an education. We need to find a very good paying job as well. We need to earn good money, save it, invest it, and also use that wealth in order to buy the things that we actually like. It's called consumerism, because again, the idea is that we are pursuing material happiness in this material world. So consumption is the way that modern societies are trying to attain and achieve human happiness as well. We discussed that, consumerism. And there is also, again, the idea of change, that there is this expectation that things are changing for the better, that everything is progressing, because ultimately this is leading us to a new world, a high-tech civilization. Again, that this is the inevitable future that awaits humanity, a high-tech, almost like a sci-fi world in which technology is going to be used to free people from the burdens of labor, solve many of the problems of the past, and people can actually pursue other interests, unencumbered, of course, by the needs to be working long hours every day, or be afflicted by the catastrophes of nature, that people will be able to control their environment through technology and create a new civilization. All right, this is what we discussed in session one. This is just a recap. Now, let's move to, in this session, session two, to part two of this topic, which is going to deal with now the actual changes. that are transpiring in Texas after 1876. And in the table of contents, if you remember, I discussed how part two is going to deal with, first and foremost, the development of transportation systems in the state of Texas. This is, again, fundamental to the uh, to the changes that are going to take place in the state of Texas as Texas is moving towards modernity. That is to say, first and foremost, before we actually discuss the advent of industries and commercial farming and the like, all of the changes that are moving Texas towards a more capitalist economy, for example, and the rise of big cities and the like, before we move into that, it is important to know that one fundamental stepping stone for this transformation was the development of transportation systems. In this case, we're going to be talking about railroads. Okay, the railroads are considered to be, in this time period, which is the 19th century, really the modern, if you will, or new form of transportation that is the most efficient, the most effective way of moving raw materials, resources, manufactured products, people across vast spans of space. So it is, again, a time when the railroad will be arriving to Texas, and we're going to see the development now of a modern railway system in the state. Now, the railroads, of course, this is something that, as a technology, initiated in Great Britain back in the 1700s. You know, the British scientists were the ones actually innovating the railroad. Okay, they were the ones actually in the process of developing the railroad when they were engaged in coal mining and also mining iron ore. So, as the British were trying to extract coal from the ground and iron ore in order to, of course, manufacture steel and ironworks and the like, they were starting the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. There was a need to transport those heavy materials. It was not possible to use beasts of burden, like ox carts and horses to pull off carts and so on, because it was not very practical. It's not very effective. So they started working on another system that enabled them to actually transport, coal and iron ore, very heavy duty materials. Again, those are tons and tons of materials that needed to be transported from the mine to the steel plant, for example. People are smelting the iron ore and making things like machines and factories and the like. So it is there that, again, the railroad got started. And so in the late 1700s, early 1800s, this process was perfected, and suddenly, again, there's going to be a railroad revolution taking place, first in England, in which people are going to now be building railroads in order to connect not only mines with steel plants, but also to connect the entire country together commercially. Towns and cities will be interconnected, again, through a system of rails. The railroad also arrived to the United States in the 1830s. And from the 1830s to the 1850s, we're going to see also a railroad revolution taking place in the United States, particularly in the north part of the country. The Northeast and the Midwest will be interconnected through a system of rails. The South lagged behind in railroad construction. But now, after the Civil War and Reconstruction process, the South is ready to now develop in a very serious way its own railroad, if you will. So here we're going to pay attention to the state of Texas, how this process occurred. All right, so now it is very, very important to understand the significance of the railroad for not only the economy of Texas, but also for the national economy at large. The United States at this time is trying to really connect all of the different regions of the country together. Okay, before the Civil War, the country was very fragmented in different regions. There was the Northeast was considered to be a very distinct region. The Midwest was also considered to be a very distinct region as well, and the U.S. South was also considered to be a very different and very distinct region as well, with different types of customs, traditions. The society was different. Even the economic system of the South was different from the economic system of the North. It was based on slave labor in the South, for example. So it was very, very fragmented. So after the Civil War, the United States is trying to reverse this fragmentation and instead bring all the areas of the country together, not only bringing the Northeast, the Midwest, and the South together, but also the so-called Wild West as well. Pretty much, we see an integration, if you will, of the different regions of the country. And this integration can only happen if those regions are interconnected commercially. That is to say, that if you build a railway system that connects the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, and the Wild West together, they can function as a single unit, commercially and economically, that is to say. Because this will enable producers anywhere. If you're a producer, for example, if you're a farmer, well, you're producing crops, grain, for example. If you're a cattle rancher, well, you're producing cattle. If you're an agricultural company that is producing sugar beets or citruses or cotton, again, those are cash crops. You're a producer as well. If you have a mine that is extracting, let's say, silver or iron ore or coal, you're producing minerals as well. That's what we mean about producers. If you are running a lumber company, again, you're producing wood. There's so many types of products, again, that people are generating during this time. Well, with a system of railroad, what is going to happen is that the products that producers generate every year are going to be consumed all over the country. Again, so in the past, before the era of the railroad, it was very difficult to really ship your product. Let's say if you live in Texas, it was very difficult to ship your product, let's say your grain or even lumber, to other parts of the country. It was not impossible, but it was so difficult and so time consuming, again, to do so. So what existed before the era of the railroad was a more regional based economy in which producers were only selling to the people of their own region. They were selling their own products, their own cattle, their own grain, and if you will, to the people that were surrounding them, if you will. But now, with the coming of the railroad, again, producers anywhere in the country, in this case, producers in Texas, are going to now have the opportunity to ship their product all over the nation. Again, because the railroad will facilitate that transportation. So again, what the railroad is going to do is create something called a national economy. Okay, so from a regional economy that existed before this time, now the United States is building for the first time a truly national economy, in which the economy of the entire nation is becoming integrated and is becoming unified. Okay, and the railroad was totally instrumental in this transformation. Okay, so it is really in the midst of the Civil War in 1862 when this idea was presented in the U.S. Congress, this idea of linking the country together. Now, this is in the midst of the Civil War, and the North is fighting the South, and you might want to ask, how is it that at this time people are talking about integrating the country together when there is, of course, a war going on between the North and the South. Yeah, it's true. But it is precisely because of the war that in Congress, in this case, we're talking about the Union, because Congress during this time is controlled by the Union, by the North, of course, by Lincoln, by the party of Lincoln, by the Republican Party, who's really fighting the South. So, what they're actually saying is, look, we're fighting the South over the issue of slavery. Again, that is really the central issue. And one of the leading factors that led to the war, as I explained earlier, again, was the fact that Southern planters wanted to introduce slavery in the Western territories. Okay, that was really one of the arguments back and forth between the North and the South, whether the Western territories should allow slavery, should permit slavery to exist or not. The North insisted that it was not permissible, it was not allowed, it was not legal to do so, and the South insisted that it was totally legal. It was one of the arguments that led to the Civil War. So it is precisely because of the Civil War that the Union, in this case the North, decided to win the race against the South, and instead of letting the Southern planters moving their slaves into the West, they said, well, we're just going to, instead of doing that, open the doors for American farmers to move in great numbers into the Western territories. So the Western territories will be used for farming by people that are going to be working the land with their own labor, and not by planters who are going to move slaves there in order to grow crops, again, with slave labor. Okay, so that was one of, again, the reasons why we're going to see this motion to integrate the Western territories into the rest of the country. That is, they're moving farmers by the millions there, and at the same time that they're moving farmers by the millions, giving them almost like free land to them, of course, to set up farms, they're also creating a series of companies to start moving the railroad into the Western territory. They're moving people over, but they're also moving railroads into the Western territories. So the same farmers that are moving into the Western territories will have access to transportation systems in order to transport the grain into different parts of the country. Again, so it just all made sense. So it is precisely in the midst of the Civil War in 1862 when U.S. Congress is now seriously commissioning a series of railroad companies to start building different rail lines all the way to the West Coast, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, the companies that were commissioned, those rail lines, were called the Pacific Railroads companies. Again, so this came with an act of Congress called the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, in which the U.S. Congress is now chartering, if you will, giving a legal permit to four railroad companies that will be known as the Pacific Railroad Companies, in order for each company to build a rail line all the way to the Pacific Ocean, to the West Coast. So, sorry, they wanted to link the eastern section of the United States with the West, commercially, that is to say. And that can only occur through the railroad system. So, those four companies were the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, and Southern Pacific. Okay, railroads. There were four railroad lines. The Northern Pacific is going to build a rail line across the northern section of the country, and the idea is not only to reach the West Coast. Of course, that's the idea. In the state of Oregon and in the state of Washington State. But at the same time, that the rail line is going to be tapping into different areas of mineral deposits or areas where there are producers, where there are farmers or agricultural companies and the like. So again, the railroads are not just built randomly, but rather the railroad is really going through the major areas of production, if you will. Okay, that is the Northern Pacific. Now, the Union and Central Pacific railroads were commissioned to build a rail line across the midsection of the United States, particularly in the Western Territories again. So those rail lines, one is going to depart, the Union Pacific departed from the eastern section of the United States, moving west, and the Central Pacific started from California going east, and at some point they were going to join their rail lines. Again, so they're really working in concert, if you will, okay, with each other. The Southern Pacific, and this is the one that is mostly concerned, again, with Texas, was commissioned to build a rail line across the southern border with Mexico, okay, which includes moving through and across Texas, okay, and eventually moving along the border into the state of New Mexico, Arizona, eventually California. Okay, so it's really going along the border. And the idea, once again, was not just to build a rail line arbitrarily or randomly, but rather to be tapping into the most productive areas of those states, whether they're tapping into agricultural companies or farms, or tapping in, cattle ranchers, lands, and so on, to provide easy access for transportation for them. That is, again, the objective, again, of the railroads. So first and foremost, you have to see that this was part of a larger project. The development of the Texas Railroad, if you will, was just an aspect of a larger project that the United States was engaged in during this time, and trying to create a national economy and unity among the states, if you will. This initiated in 1862, and it's going to continue way after the end of the Civil War. It will continue even during the process of Reconstruction, all the way to the end of that century, by 1900, all this process of railroad construction. This was considered part of a railroad revolution in the United States. Okay? Now, let's talk about building Texas railroads. Of course, there's the Southern Pacific that is moving across Texas. It's a very important rail line, although this is a more of a national project, once again, that is going to connect Texas with the east part of the country, but also connect Texas with the western states of New Mexico, Arizona, and California, of course. But inside of Texas, we're going to see yet additional companies being chartered, in this case by the state of Texas, is going to charter a great number of different companies for the purpose of building different rail lines in different regions of Texas. This is alongside the Southern Pacific rail lines, by the way. Okay, so from 1876 to 1900, we're going to see, for example, one of the main companies chartered by the Texas legislature here was the Texas and Pacific Railroad. It was known as the TNP, Texas and Pacific Railroad. This is a company that was chartered by the state of Texas to build rail lines, and in order to incentivize this railroad company to build a railroad, the state of Texas created a series of incentives and rewards for this company in order to do this state project. This package of incentives and rewards came in the form of something called the Land Grant of 1876. This is very, very similar to the empresario contracts that we discussed when we were discussing, for example, the Texas Revolution, how the state of Mexico, for example, gave land to empresarios or immigration officials or agents in order to bring colonists into Texas. So one of the incentives or rewards that the empresarios received was huge tracts of land as a form of payment, if you will, for their services. This is a very, very similar, type of procedure now that the state of Texas is creating with the Texas and Pacific Railroad, okay, with this railroad company. In other words, look, build us a railroad, and in return, the state of Texas is going to actually give you land grants, that is to say, for every mile of rail lines that you build. According to the land grant of 1876, the railroad company was going to receive as a reward 2 miles of lands on each side per track mile. Okay, on each side. So in reality, there's 4 miles of land, 2 on each side per every mile of track that they built. So this was a great incentive for a railroad company, because we're going to get a lot of land in the process. It's just not building the railroad, but we're going to get a lot of land. So again, the railroad companies will become one of the largest landowners in the state of Texas at the end of this process, by 1900. The largest landowners, by the way. In the end, the state of Texas ended up chartering not just one company to build railroads, but ultimately it chartered 40 railroad companies, many of which were actually very small, companies, by the way. We're not talking about very large corporations. Those were actually small-sized companies that were chartered by the state of Texas and were commissioned to build rail lines in different places. It can be just connecting one city to another, or maybe a few towns with each other, and so on. Again, those were actually smaller projects, if you will, with the same incentive of giving them 2 miles of land on each side per track mile as well. So at the end of the day, by 1900, altogether, the 40 companies that were engaged in this state project ended up receiving about 35 million acres of land. Again, those 40 companies. So, you can only imagine how, just like the empresarios during the colonization process of Texas that were bringing American colonists, that ended up really with large colonies with a lot of land, and they became landowners that used that land in order to create real estate companies. The railroads are also at the end of the day, becoming large landowners as well in their own right. And there will be, of course, many different kinds of commercial uses that the railroad companies will use the land for. Okay, so there's a lot of commercial activities that they go on again in those lands. By 1900, those 40 companies build about 3,000 miles of track across Texas. Okay, so again, there's significant railroad development taking place here. Now, another thing to contemplate here is that those railroad companies, those 40 railroad companies that were engaged in this project, were not only subsidized by the state of Texas, those subsidies that I mentioned, receiving, for example, land grants and so on by the state of Texas, they were also subsidized by local communities in the state of Texas. As a matter of fact, again, there's a lot of people in Texas that welcomed the railroad, and they saw the railroad as essential for their own businesses and their own farms and cattle ranches, for the producers, in other words. This is greatly needed. And local communities, in order to attract railroad companies into their own communities so they can build a rail line to their own communities, because they wanted access to the railroad again, they created subsidies for the railroads, in which, for example, one subsidy was land donations. They were willing to donate lands to the railroad as a reward, as an incentive for bringing the railroad companies to their nearby communities so they can have a train station nearby, a rail station nearby their farm or their farming town or mine. Doesn't matter. You own a company, a lumber company, and the like. Those local communities wanted the railroad to build a rail line again near to their communities and their businesses. Okay. Another subsidy was provide tax exemptions to those companies. So they were donating lands to them, but also accepting them from taxes. In other words, look, you're not going to pay any property taxes on your property. So you're being given land, but you're not going to pay property taxes on those lands. Okay, you're exempt. If your railroad company decides to build warehouses and other facilities in those lands and so on, you're not going to pay any taxes, for those properties and so on. So this was a great incentive, again, for those companies to actually build rail lines, pretty much, wherever they were invited, and they were given those subsidies as well. Okay, so this is how Texas Railroad looked like. This is the map by 1900, just at the end of that century. This is how it looks like. Okay, it looks something like this. They already have connected the area of Houston, for example, and Galveston, connected that area with San Antonio, Texas, Laredo, Austin, Dallas Fort Worth area, and the Panhandle, and of course, not to mention El Paso, of course, along the border with Mexico as well. It's also interconnected, with the western side of Texas as well, with the western cities. It's all becoming more and more integrated by this time. So, as I explained just a moment ago, the railroads developed a commercial and trade network in the state of Texas that connected local producers to the U.S. economy. This is perhaps the greatest significance of the Texas railroads, is that for the first time in Texas history, producers in Texas are going to have access to the national market. In other words, if you're producing grain in Texas, your grain will be consumed outside of Texas. It can be consumed in other areas like Kansas, can be consumed in the northeast part of the country, wherever your grain can go. If you're growing cotton, if you're growing sugar, if you're a cattle rancher, your cattle will be shipped across into other areas of the United States. We're going to be talking about cattle ranching in greater detail again as we move along this topic, of course. So whatever you're producing in Texas, your product for the most part is leaving the state and is being processed, manufactured, consumed around the country. Okay? This is the significance of the railroad. It's really now connecting the state of Texas to the national economy. Okay? It's becoming now part of a national economy. No longer just a state economy or regional economy, but again, a national economy. Okay? All right, so we're moving now into sorry about that. Part 3. Part 3 is going to look now at the development of a commercial industrial economy in the state of Texas. So part two look at just transportation systems, which was essential for now the development of a commercial industrial economy. An economy based on commerce and an economy based on industry. So the Texas economy is going to be changing dramatically from an economy just based on agricultural production for regional consumption. Okay, what people were doing before 1876, as I explained, was just, for the most part, the masses, if you will, of farmers in Texas were just growing their own food. Okay, they were just growing the food that they needed year by year, working in families and the like. Again, it was more, again, for subsistence or for survival, if you will, needs. That was the kind of economy that existed in Texas. Now, of course, there were producers that were producing for the market. There were, of course, the planters were producing cotton and sugar for the market. That was considered a more commercial type of agriculture, if you will. There were some cattle ranchers as well that were producing cattle for the outside market, driving cattle into other parts of the country, like Louisiana, for example, or Mexico. But now the entire state is moving towards an economy based on commerce. That is to say, what in the state of Texas people are going to be doing is produce food products or any kind of product for the market. Okay? It's not that growing your own food is going to grow out of fashion. People will continue to subsist from the land, grow whatever food they need, of course, but they're moving now to business. They're now seeing their own land, their own activities as a business opportunity. Okay? So this is what we mean about a commercial economy. Is now commerce. People are now working to make money, in other words. Everything that they're doing is, again, to make money and to progress. Remember, we talk about materialist values, for example. People want to improve their material conditions. They want to live better. They want to have more money. They want to live more comfortably. Again, this is part of this material progress, this culture that is entering Texas, if you will. So commerce was considered essential for material progress. So everybody, again, is now influenced by this type of thinking. Okay, that we need to, move into business. But at the same time, there's also going to be a movement towards industrialization. Industry did not exist in the state of Texas. There were no factories to speak of or industrial plants before 1876. Texas just didn't participate in the Industrial Revolution prior to this time. But now there will be an industrial revolution that, from the perspective of Texas history, this is the very first industrial revolution for the state. This is the very first wave of industrialization for the state of Texas. Okay? And more, the Texas economy is going to be based on industry. It will continue to be based on in agriculture. Agriculture is not going away. It will continue to be central to the economy of the state. That's one of the central pillars. Again, agriculture, one of the central pillars for the Texas economy. But now there's going to be a second pillar that is also becoming quite central to the Texas economy, and that is going to be industries, of course, an industrial economy. That's what we mean about a commercial industrial economy. An economy based on commerce, that everything is being commercialized, every activity is now an activity to make money, and also that the economy is moving more and more towards industry as well. Okay? So again, this is an integral aspect of modernity. Remember, modern societies are societies that have an industrial economy. Those are actually societies that have factories and have machinery that are producing products very efficiently, very rapidly, and they generate what is called mass production. Okay, mass production. All right. So let's discuss then the commercial enterprises that are going to be fundamental in this transition towards this commercial industrial economy in Texas. Okay, and we start first and foremost with agriculture itself. Okay, as I mentioned in session one and at the beginning of this second session, the traditional economy of Texas was agriculture. This is how the state sustained itself prior to this time. Okay, I explained that. It was an agricultural society, an agricultural state per excellence. The vast majority of the people were farmers. And I explained also that the way people engage in agriculture and called farming is that they pretty much work in families. They worked as family units, as a family enterprise, and everybody worked the land together, and so on and so forth. They were just subsisting from the land. Growing the foods, the products that they required for their survival. They were also raising animals. They had an animal farm, and so on and so forth. Again, very traditional setting. But now there's going to be a shift after 1876 in the state of Texas. We're going to see that this traditional agriculture is now on the way out, and we're going to see a new type of agriculture, a more commercial agriculture, that is referred as cash crop agriculture. Cash crop agriculture. That is to say that the Texas farmer realized that, well, we do have a lot of land here. We have been growing our own food year by year, and that's all fine. But we also want to make money. Okay? And in addition to the food that we need to eat every year, we're going to devote all of this land, that additional land that we have, to grow cash crops. Crops that are worth cash. In other words, those are crops that are in demand, that there's a demand for them. Whether it's in Texas or in the United States, there's a demand, let's say, for cotton or wheat, so on. Well, we want to grow that as well, because by growing that, we're going to improve our material condition as a family. We're going to have more money around. And we always need money, of course, to buy the things that we need, clothing, fertilizers, you name it, improve the house and so on, make repairs and the like. They want to live better, in other words. So they're moving into business. Now, what's very important to note here is that the Texas farmer realized that this was the perfect time to move into business, because more and more people are demanding food products in the United States. They realize that. And why is that? Well, because there is an industrial revolution taking place in the United States, particularly in certain areas like in the north, northeast, but also in the American South. The American South is industrializing. The Industrial Revolution, one of the effects that it had was that it attracted a lot of people to move into cities. People that were moving from rural areas from the United States, those were farmers that were moving by the millions, literally, to those industrial centers in search for work. But there's also a lot of people from Europe Those are immigrants, if you will, that are arriving in great numbers into the United States. They're arriving from places like Italy, from Germany, Greece, Poland, different parts of Europe. They're moving into the United States in search for work as well. So one of the things that is happening in the United States is that cities are growing exponentially in the United States. Okay, they're becoming gigantic population centers. Cities like New York and Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, for example, are reaching 1 million residents or over around this time. So they're growing exponentially. So the question is, who's going to feed the population of the growing cities in the United States? Okay? Cities demand food products because people in the cities don't grow their own food. That's one of the downsides of living in a city is that if you live in a city, the food has to be imported into the city from without. Those are actually products that are grown in the countryside by farmers. Cities don't generate their own food. So there's a growing demand for food products, all kinds of products, whether we're talking about grain like wheat, corn, rice, of course, other cereals, oats, and the like, beans, you name it, legumes, again, of all kinds, vegetables, and so on. Again, food products in general. People have to eat, of course. And this is something that you cannot do without. I mean, this is not something that grows out of fashion. Food will always be in demand because this is a basic necessity for human survival. That is to say. So the Texas farmer realized that, and they said, well, if the cities are growing, there's immigration taking place, and now we have millions of people living in American cities demanding more and more food, this is a great time to move into business. Abandon the old ways of doing things, this idea of just growing your own food, subsisting from the land, which is fine. I mean, it was regarded as a very noble endeavor. You own your own land, you grow your own food, you sustain your own family that way, everybody works together. It was considered an ideal setting. But now the values are changing, the times are changing, and the Texas farmer realizes that this is the time to make money. In other words, we can actually make money now. So let's make money. So they're moving into something called cash crop agriculture, and they're transforming their farms, their traditional farms of moms and pops, into something called a commercial farm. Okay, a commercial farm. The farm is now going to be a business. That's what a commercial farm means. The farm is now a business. Okay, we're going to run it as a business, and we're here to make money. So we need to revamp everything that we know, and we need to transform our farm into an industrial farm. We're moving into the era of mass production. That is to say, mass production. Just like industries. They have new technologies, new knowledge in order to accelerate the rate of production, to maximize profits. Well, the Texas farmer is thinking along those lines as well. We are going to maximize profits, but we have to change the way we do things. We cannot operate with the same tools, with the same knowledge of the past, because this is the era of science and technology. So we need to integrate it. And that's exactly what happened in the state of Texas, is that there's going to be a new generation of politicians that are going to be very influential in the state of Texas in pushing for reforms. They are called the New South Reformers. They call themselves the New South Reformers. This is a new generation, again, of politicians who were trained, educated in universities under the new science that I explained in session 1, and also that were very, very well versed, very well acquainted with the latest technologies that were coming out during this time. Again, so this is the generation, again, that looked to the future. that had a vision of the future for the state of Texas, in which Texas was going to become really a very dynamic economy based on industry, based on commercial farming, using the latest developments of science and technology and the like. Again, so they look to the future again for inspiration, not to the past. They did not want to return to the past. They wanted to abandon the past. They wanted to abandon the traditional ways, if you will. Again, so they were pushing for modernity, that is to say, in the state of Texas. That's why they were called reformers. They wanted the South, Texas was part of the South, to become a new society, a new economy. That is to say, okay. So the new reformers, the New South reformers, as they were called, were advising the Texas farmer that in order to succeed in this new economy, in this commercial agricultural economy, that they needed to first and foremost diversify. Okay, they push for something called diversification. Okay, so what is diversification? Okay, so what they were advising is that the Texas farmer needed to incorporate in their new commercial farms different kinds of crops. In other words, don't just grow one crop, one type of crop in your property, okay, in your business, okay? Because if you're, let's say, you're accustomed to grow corn, and this is what you have been growing, your parents have been growing corn, and this is the tradition. Well, that's all fine, but what will happen, let's say, if corn has a bad year because there's just so much corn in the market that the price of corn just falls? What's going to happen to your business venture, to your commercial farm? Well, you're going to fail because declining prices again is going to pretty much leave you, without any profits. So instead of relying on just one single crop, you have to diversify and you say, okay, look, I'm going to grow corn, it's true, but I'm also going to grow wheat, I'm also going to grow cotton, and perhaps on the side some vegetables like spinach, etc. Again, because at the end of the year, let's say if one crop fails, you still have other crops to rely on. Okay, you can stay in business, you stay afloat, that is to say. So they were pretty much advising new economic strategies for how to stay in business in this new economy. In other words, you have to leave the ways of the past, don't rely on a single crop, but diversify. Different kinds of cash crops you have to include, in your fields. You also have to integrate something called crop rotation. So what is crop rotation? Okay, so crop rotation is simply allowing the land to rest. Land that is being used for intensive agriculture. You use it for 5-7 years. Let's say a plot of land, you use it to grow cotton or corn, etc. And that's what you're doing year after year after year. So what happens after the fifth or seventh year is that despite the fact that you're introducing fertilizers into the land, you're going to deplete the soil, you're going to tire it and exhaust it, and it will become barren. Nothing will grow in there afterwards. So to avoid this problem, it is important to rotate. In other words, look, you grow crops in a very intensive fashion in this plot of land for 5 or 7 years, but after that you leave it to rest and you move into another plot. And you're not going to come back not until maybe 10-15 years later. Okay, you're going to let this land rest. You're perhaps going to move cattle into this land in order to fertilize it, because cattle is very well known as a fertilizing agent, if you will. You move animals there so they can just be there again, pretty much fertilizing the land with their droppings. And you're letting the land rest to be used for a later period, of course. So this is just, again, the use of new techniques, new scientific knowledge to advise it on a population that perhaps was not very well informed about those new ideas, those new findings, but they're being advised, by the New South reformers. They're also promoting, in the state of Texas, the reformers, they're promoting scientific farming. That is to say, they're trying to create workshops or seminars, conferences, outlets of education, if you will, for farmers to become updated in the latest scientific developments that are coming out in the world. What farmers need to know about what modern science is discovering about agriculture. New types of fertilizers, for example, what kind of new techniques to use, what is the latest machinery, for example, that is now becoming more available and in fashion. Pesticides as well. There's plagues, that affect the field. Well, they're actually suggesting that there are certain chemicals or pesticides that could be used to deal with those pests, if you will, and so on. So they're really promoting a more scientific approach for farming. Okay, that's the most important, again, take about the New South reformers. Okay, they're really promoting a scientific approach. Now, of course, during this time, we see the introduction in the United States of agricultural technologies that were not available in the past. Again, the Industrial Revolution is now moving forth, creating new tools, new machines that farmers could use now in order to accelerate the rate of production. And more, agriculture is becoming more and more mechanized. In other words, that just as industry is becoming mechanized, in which everything that industry produces is produced by machinery, the same is now beginning to take place in the world of agriculture. That growing crops doesn't have to be necessarily the endeavor, the labor of human beings and animals anymore. Now, instead of using animals for plowing the land, you can use tractors, for example. There's a new technology. You can use tractors to actually plow the land. You can use reapers and shredders and the like, something that was done manually, if you will, by families working together. Now, machines can do that very quickly and more efficiently, if you will. Okay? There's the use of fertilizers as well, and of course, the introduction of electrical irrigation systems as well. What is an electrical irrigation system? Well, as the name suggests, this is a system by which people are now drilling into the ground in search for water. They tap into a reservoir of water beneath their property and they pump the water out of the ground through the use of electrical water pumps. And they use that water to irrigate their fields. This is a very, very effective way of staying in business, because if you're just going to rely on the blessings of rain, on the blessings of nature, which is rain again year by year, well, what happens when there's a bad year? There's a drought. That happens cyclically. In other words, it's part of the cycles of nature. There are cycles of rain, there are cycles of drought. It's just part of nature. So in order to stay in business, it is recommended for farmers to employ the latest technologies like irrigation systems, for example, based on electricity, water pumps, and the like. Again, so these are just a few of the equipments of the agricultural technologies that were coming out during the late 19th century. They looked rather obsolete for our standards, of course, but it was totally revolutionary for the people living during this time. It was considered, marvels. There were, of course, plows that still rely on horses again, but they were considered to be more effective. Again, those are actually part tractor, part still, part of a traditional form of plowing the land, in which people use horses and a plow to plow the land again. But in this case, now people are using a large machine, a piece of it, tying it to a cart pulled by horses again, in which this is facilitating really the preparation of the land for cultivation. Okay, there's also going to be the proliferation of cotton farms in the state of Texas. One of the most profitable crops during this time was cotton. Although the prices of cotton were in decline during this time, despite that fact, cotton was still largely profitable in the world economy. It was profitable for somebody to be growing cotton and pretty much shipping it out, because there was really an ongoing demand around the world for cotton. The growing industries in Europe, for example, in places like Germany, France, demanded more and more cotton. Anyway, there was always an opportunity to ship it out and make money. So there was an explosion of cotton farms across the state of Texas. Again, in many cases, those were actually small farmers that were just integrating this crop, cotton, as one of the main crops. They, of course, were growing other crops alongside it, but this is one of the main crops that they relied on in many cases. In other cases, what happened is that people who did not own land, they were not in control of their own land, were actually renting land in order to grow cotton. Imagine if you were a very skilled farmer, but for some reason you did not have the land because maybe you had to sell it in the past, you lost it in a transaction, or you put a mortgage on your farm and you lost the farm, but you're out of the land, in other words. But you know how to grow cotton. It was so profitable to grow cotton that you could always just rent a piece of land from a landlord in order to move you and your family into this land, pay rent every month to this landlord, and continue to grow cotton and still make money. This is called tenancy. Again, tenancy are, farmers who are simply renting land in order to grow cotton, in order to make money. They're not in control of their own farm. It's called tenancy, in other words. In other instances, what happens is that some farmers make deals with agricultural companies, for example, that are growing cotton, and they work inside of those agricultural companies, and the company itself, in many cases, pays this farmer and the family for growing cotton for the family with a share of the crop. Okay? In other words, you go to this agricultural company and say, I'm very skilled at growing cotton. I know all about it. Okay? I used to do it for many years, but I don't have any land. Okay? I know that your company holds thousands of acres, and I will be willing to move into a section of your land in order to grow cotton for you, and to get paid. In many cases, they got paid directly with money. In many cases, they got paid with a share of the crop. That is to say, what the company used to say is, look, I'll allow you to grow cotton in my company, but you give me a share of the harvest that you're producing, and you're able to stay in the land and actually use this other section that you're keeping in order to make money. In other words, you're getting paid actually with a share of the crop. This is called sharecropping. Okay, you're producing cotton for a company, but the company is really allowing you to keep a share of the harvest for your own profits, if you will. You can actually turn around and sell this product to a company or to sell it to an industry and so on that is buying cotton, and that you can make money. Those are actually, again, things that are emerging in Texas. There's a proliferation of cotton farms. Some people are actually paying rents to a landlord in order just to grow cotton to make money. Others are actually working in the land of agricultural companies and getting paid with a share of the crop. Again, growing cotton. All right. So now we turn to another very important component of this new economy in the state of Texas. This commercial industrial economy that is arising after 1876 is giving rise to not only a cash crop agriculture, but also the rise of new industries. As I mentioned, this is going to introduce for the very first time in the state of Texas the Industrial Revolution. There will be a revolution in industry. There's going to be new industries, factories, manufacturing plants propping up in different places of Texas. And Texas is now developing a new economic system that will be called industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism. So, what is industrial capitalism? First and foremost, industrial capitalism, again, is an economic system that is based on the idea of private property. First and foremost, when we talk about capitalism as such, we're talking about, first and foremost, an economic system that introduced for the first time the concept of private property, that individuals in society have the right to own property. That occurred in the 1700s in England. Again, this is the very first place in the world where capitalism emerged. Okay, this idea of private property. For what purpose is property created? For what purpose is property allowed for individuals to own and control? The purpose for individuals to own property is to make money. That is the essence of capitalism, is private property, first and foremost, but also to use that property to generate wealth. Wealth creation or wealth generation, whichever you want to call it. So that means you also have to allow individuals to create an enterprise, because how else are you going to make money? You have to form a business. It's called an enterprise. So first and foremost, understand that industrial capitalism, the way it emerged in the 1700s in England, was a new economic system that allowed individuals to own property in order to make money. And the way that this is done is by allowing individuals the freedom to create enterprises. This is called free enterprise. Free enterprise. Okay, this is how am I going to make money? I'm going to open up a shop, let's say. It can be a bakery. It can be let's say, a factory that I'm going to be manufacturing clothing, for example. A candy factory, a candy shop, you name it. Doesn't matter what it is. You're going to be crafting something that you're going to sell it, and this is how you're going to make money, in other words. All right? This later on, of course, translated into factories and industries. People using property in order to move in machinery and create a large factory, a manufacturing plant for the purpose of making money. Rather simple. Okay? This is why it's called industrial capitalism, because the way that in England people started to really create wealth, generate wealth, make money, was by establishing industries and factories. Okay, I'm going to manufacture clothing, for example, or ironworks or steel, etc. And I'm going to sell it and I'm going to make money. Okay, this is the way that we're going to be generating wealth. But there's a third component to industrial capitalism. One is private property, the other one is free enterprise, and the third is wage labor. Why? Well, because not everybody is going to have the means, the resources to buy property and create an enterprise. Those that do have the money will become the owners of industry, the factory owners, the owners of the shops and the like, okay? But what about if you don't have those resources? You don't have the money, the wealth to really start a business in the first place. There's a way you can make money. If you don't have property, if you don't have an enterprise, the way to make money is to work for any of the shops or factories or industries for a wage. In fact, they're hiring you. Those places are actually hiring people to work there on a permanent basis, on a set schedule, and they're going to pay you a wage at the end of the week or at the end of the month, doesn't matter. You're going to get paid for the amount of time that you work inside of that enterprise. So it's also wage labor. Again, this is something new. That began in England. This is a new way of organizing society. Society that did not work like that before the Industrial Revolution. There were no industries, there was no private property, there was no wage labor. People were working the land. They were farmers or peasants, just growing their own food. But now that there's an Industrial Revolution, again, we see a new way of doing things. The way that people are coming together to get things done is that people are allowed to own property, form businesses, factories, and everything is produced inside of a factory. People are more and more coming into those factories in search for work. They're earning wages. This is how people earn their living. The factory owner makes money by the manufacturing of the products. They sell those products and they make money. But the workers work inside of those factories. They arrive there from the countryside. They arrive there from those farming societies that are moving there in search for work, and they get paid, and this is how they earn their living. It's called wage labor. So it's a whole new way of doing things and living, if you will. This is the way that was implemented and adopted in the United States in the early 1800s, and now this system called industrial capitalism is coming into Texas after 1876. Okay, industrial capitalism, free enterprise, and wage labor. For the first time, more and more people in the state of Texas are going to be earning their livelihood in factories and industries, working there for wages. They're going to be earning wages again. We're going to see an upsurge of shops across Texas, industries, manufacturers of different kinds. There is indeed an industrial revolution taking place. In 1870, there were only 2,400 of those types of industries in the state of Texas. Only 2,400 in 1870. And those were very, very small shops, very small manufacturers, if you will. Might be just like a little shop in which there was a blacksmith who hired maybe a couple of people there that were actually producing things like plows or whatever, okay, horseshoes and the like. Very small shops. We're not really talking about large factories. So in 1870 there were 2,500 shops, industries, and manufacturers that were very, very small, operated by just a handful of people. And this is going to change dramatically, that by 1890 there were over 5,000 of them, 5,268 now new shops, industries, and manufacturers that were becoming the type of industries that we're most familiar with. Those are large factories that are now hiring hundreds of people to work there, or lumber companies, for example, that are hiring hundreds of people, or mining companies and the like. Again, this is now an industrial size type of enterprise, again, that we're going to be looking at towards the 1890s. By 1890, 63% of the Texas economy was based on industrial production alone. Again, so industrial production is becoming more and more central to the Texas economy than agriculture. Now, this is not really eliminating agriculture by any means. Agriculture continues to be one of the central pillars, of course, but again, you can only see how industrial production is really becoming extremely central, increasingly important for the Texas economy. Again, so this was indeed the very first industrial revolution for the state of Texas. Okay, now when we come back in session 3, we're going to explain very thoroughly the industries that arrived to the state of Texas, the specific industries. We're going to go one by one. There'll be a host of different industries, from the lumber industries all the way to mining, oil, and the like, including, of course, cattle ranching. It will become an industry in its own right. And towards the end of session 2, we're going to look at the rise of large industrial cities as well. So session 3 is going to become, central to understanding the specific industries, but also the rise of large cities. We're going to identify which one the main important industrial centers of Texas, some of the features of the industrial city, how people live there, and so on. All of that, of course, when we come back in session 3. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 3 when we come back.